He placed one final bet, and the house took everything, including his life. Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. Let's build this mystery-loving circle. Tell me where you're tuning in from in the comments. Your voices make every case feel more alive. Let's begin. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead had seen its fair share of scandals, but even the most fervent gossip could not have anticipated the strange and unsettling affair that would soon unfold at the King's Arms. The establishment, known for its modest yet comfortable accommodations, had been hosting a rather peculiar guest of late, a man who called himself Mr. Jonathan Royston, though few believed that was his real name. Royston was not a typical visitor to St. Mary Mead. He was a man of the city, sharp-eyed and well-dressed, with the air of someone accustomed to both luxury and danger. He spent his evenings at the King's Arms, nursing a brandy, his fingers toying absent-mindedly with a deck of cards. He had a habit of making small wagers with the locals, nothing outrageous, just a few shillings here and there on hands of whist or backgammon. But there was something about him that set people on edge. Perhaps it was the way he watched others, as if he were calculating their every move, or perhaps it was the slight smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Then, one morning, Royston was found dead in his room. The door was locked from the inside, the key still in the lock. The window, overlooking the narrow alley behind the inn, was latched as well. A single playing card lay on the floor beside the bed, the ace of spades. There was no sign of violence, no apparent cause of death. He simply lay there, fully dressed, his face twisted into an expression of shock or disbelief. The only other clue was a sheet of paper on the nightstand, upon which, in a hurried and shaky hand, he had scrawled 4 words: "I should have known." The village constable, a well-meaning but unimaginative man named Inspector Graves, was at a loss. Poison? Perhaps. But why had the victim locked the door? If it was suicide, where was the bottle, the glass, the note of confession? If it was murder, how had the killer escaped? It was at this impasse that Miss Marple, ever the keen observer of human nature, was drawn into the affair. Having been at the King's Arms only the evening before, she recalled seeing Royston deep in conversation with a stranger, a tall man in a grey coat with an unusual scar along his jawline. The conversation had been hushed, but the tension in Royston's posture had been unmistakable. Miss Marple, ever polite, had made an excuse to pass by their table just in time to hear a snippet of their exchange. "You don't understand," Royston had said, his voice low but urgent. "This isn't just a game anymore." The man in the grey coat had replied, his voice calm but with an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. "It never was, Mr. Royston." Miss Marple had seen many peculiar things in her lifetime, and while a locked-room mystery was not an everyday occurrence, she had long since learned that the most baffling puzzles often had the simplest solutions. The key, she knew, was not in what was present, but in what was missing. And so, as the police puzzled over the locked room and the cryptic note, Miss Marple sat quietly in the parlour of the inn, sipping her tea, her mind working through the tangled web of possibilities. The ace of spades was no ordinary clue. It was a message, a warning, and Miss Marple intended to find out exactly to whom it had been sent. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a gentle clink, her eyes thoughtful as she listened to the murmur of voices in the hall. The King's Arms had become a hive of activity since Royston's body was discovered. Inspector Graves had taken up temporary residence in the inn's small sitting room, issuing orders in his gruff, methodical manner. His men moved through the corridors with the purposefulness of those convinced they were conducting a thorough investigation. Yet Miss Marple knew better. She had seen it before. Policemen measuring, noting, questioning, yet missing the very thing that would unravel the entire mystery. It was not their fault, of course. The law trained them to follow procedures, to gather physical evidence and account for alibis. But crime, real crime, did not always adhere to neat procedures. Human nature. That was where the answers truly lay. She stood, smoothing her skirts, and made her way to the landing where the room in question lay. The door remained locked for the moment, the key still in the possession of Inspector Graves. He was speaking to the innkeeper, Mr. Bellingham, a thin, nervous man who wrung his hands as he spoke. "I swear to you, Inspector, the man barely spoke to anyone. He kept to himself, save for the occasional card game. Paid in advance for the week, never caused trouble. And you're sure you didn't hear anything unusual last night?" Mr. Bellingham hesitated. Well, there was something. Not a noise exactly, but just before midnight I was coming up the stairs when I thought I saw a shadow moving under his door, as if someone was inside, pacing. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now. He shuddered. Inspector Graves made a note in his book. "And you're certain the door was locked?" "Absolutely. I tried it myself when I knocked in the morning. Had to fetch my spare key before I could get in." Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the door. A locked room, a dead man, and a playing card. It all seemed too theatrical, too deliberately staged. Just then, another figure entered the corridor. A young maid, Alice, her face pale as she clutched her apron. She looked hesitant, as if she had something to say but did not wish to attract attention. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, gave her a reassuring smile. "My dear," she said gently, "have you remembered something?" Alice glanced at Inspector Graves, then back at Miss Marple. "It's probably nothing, but I clean the rooms every morning, and Mr. Royston's was always in perfect order. He never left things lying about, never a single thing out of place." She swallowed. "But last night, before I finished for the evening, I walked past his door and saw something strange. A coat, his coat, was lying on the floor, half inside the room, half sticking out under the door, as if someone had dropped it in a hurry." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And was it still there this morning?" Alice shook her head. "No, miss, it was gone." Inspector Graves frowned. Perhaps the man picked it up before locking the door for the night. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. But the thought nagged at her. If Royston had dropped his coat, why would he not have retrieved it immediately? And if someone else had been in the room with him, why would they leave the door locked behind them? Unless, of course, that was precisely what they wanted everyone to believe. A locked room suggested an impossible crime, but Miss Marple had long since learned that impossibilities were merely puzzles waiting to be solved. The answer was always in what was overlooked, in the subtle details others dismissed. Her gaze drifted toward the window. Still latched, still seemingly untouched. But a man like Royston, a gambler, did not live cautiously. He lived with risk. He calculated, adjusted, and adapted. So if he had indeed played his final game, then somewhere, within the pieces left behind, was the move that cost him his life. Miss Marple intended to find it. Miss Marple watched as Inspector Graves cleared his throat, tapping his pencil against his notebook in that deliberate way men often did when they wished to appear decisive. He turned his attention back to the innkeeper. "Mr. Bellingham, you said Royston spoke to very few people. Did anyone visit him during his stay? Any particular individuals he showed interest in?" The innkeeper shifted uncomfortably. "Not that I saw, Inspector. Just the usual villagers who come by for a drink and, of course, the guests." "And the man he spoke to last night, the one in the grey coat?" Miss Marple asked gently. Bellingham hesitated, his expression tightening. Well, yes, that gentleman. He came in late yesterday, asked for a drink but didn't seem interested in company. When Mr. Royston noticed him, he went straight over and they talked in hushed voices. I couldn't hear much, but it seemed rather tense." Inspector Graves nodded. "And after they spoke, did Royston seem upset?" Bellingham glanced at Miss Marple, as if reluctant to contradict her presence, then admitted, "I'd say so. He looked troubled, kept staring at the door as if expecting someone else to walk in." Miss Marple stored that away. A man accustomed to playing his odds wouldn't rattle easily. What had changed? Inspector Graves turned to the young maid, Alice, who still clutched the edge of her apron. "Alice, what time did you last see Mr. Royston alive?" She swallowed. "I brought up a tray for him just before 10. He'd asked for a bottle of brandy earlier, but I don't think he'd touched it yet. He seemed distracted, almost like he was waiting for something." "And did he say anything to you?" Alice hesitated. "Not really. Just thank you in a quiet sort of way. But when I left, I heard him muttering under his breath. Something about a bad hand or a bad deal, I think." Miss Marple's keen ears caught the way Alice's voice wavered slightly. Not from nervousness alone. There was something she was holding back. "And the coat you saw on the floor?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Alice paled slightly but nodded. "Yes, miss. I remember thinking it was odd, but I was tired, and I didn't stop to think." Inspector Graves gave a non-committal grunt, making another note. "We'll come back to that. For now, let's speak with the other guests." The first was a Mr. Peter Colby, a traveling salesman who had been staying at the inn for nearly a week. A stout man with a round, ruddy face, he had an affable air but was quick to insist that he had no involvement whatsoever. "I barely spoke to the fellow," Colby said, shifting in his seat. "He was a card player. I gathered that much, but I don't gamble myself. Bad habit, you see. No good comes from it. You were in the common room last night." "Oh, yes. Had a pint and turned in early. Must have been in my room by 10:30. Didn't hear a thing after that. Solid sleeper, me." Miss Marple noted the way he scratched at his neck as he spoke, a small but telltale nervous gesture. Next was Miss Evelyn Harrington, a woman in her late 40s, traveling alone. She had sharp features and the precise manner of someone who enjoyed order. "I met Mr. Royston briefly," she said coolly. "We exchanged pleasantries, but nothing more. I retired early, well before anything happened." Inspector Graves studied her. "And you heard nothing in the night?" "Nothing unusual," she said smoothly, but her fingers twisted a handkerchief in her lap, betraying a slight unease. Finally, there was Mr. James Felton, a quiet man who had arrived at the inn just the day before. He was slender, with tired eyes and an air of preoccupation. He claimed to have no real interaction with Royston at all. "I was in my room reading," he said simply. "Didn't even know anything was amiss until morning." "Did you see or hear anything strange?" "No," he answered too quickly. Miss Marple's sharp gaze rested on him. He wasn't lying outright, but there was hesitation there. Something held back. As the questioning wrapped up, Miss Marple reflected on the inconsistencies. Colby, so insistent on his early night, yet fidgeting under questioning. Miss Harrington's smooth responses, but the twisting of her handkerchief. And Felton, reluctant to say too much. And then there was the missing coat. A locked room. A gambler's last game. And too many people claiming to have seen nothing at all. Deception lurked beneath the surface, and Miss Marple intended to uncover it. Miss Marple sat quietly in the parlour of the King's Arms, her fingers resting lightly against the fine china of her teacup. The faint murmur of the village outside was a stark contrast to the tangled web forming in her mind. Every person Inspector Graves had questioned had given just enough truth to seem credible, yet each left small, uneasy gaps that did not sit well. Mr. Royston had been a gambler, a man who lived by odds and risks, yet in the end it seemed he had gambled on the wrong thing. The question was, what had he wagered, and against whom? Inspector Graves sat across from her, his thick brows furrowed. "I don't like it, Miss Marple. Too many loose ends." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Crimes are like knitting, Inspector. A tangle of knots at first, but with a bit of patience, everything can be unravelled." He exhaled sharply. "You think one of them did it? The salesman, the lady traveller, or the quiet man?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the staircase leading up to the rooms. All of them have something to hide. The trick is knowing which secrets matter. Mr. Royston's past remained an enigma, but one thing was clear. He had known his killer. The locked door suggested a deliberate misdirection, a need to make his death appear impossible. The playing card, the ace of spades, was a message. And then there was the missing coat, an oddity no one could quite explain. She rose, setting her cup aside. I should like to speak with Mr. Felton again. They found him in the common room, seated by the fire with a newspaper held up, though his eyes were unfocused. He looked up as they approached, something flickering in his expression before he carefully masked it. Miss Marple settled into the chair across from him. Mr. Felton, I do hope you don't mind indulging an old woman's curiosity. I was just thinking about something rather odd. Felton's fingers tensed around the paper. Oh? You arrived at the inn only yesterday, didn't you? Yes. And yet you seemed quite familiar with Mr. Royston. Felton hesitated, then let out a slow breath. I suppose there's no use denying it. I did know him, a long time ago. Inspector Graves straightened. And you didn't think to mention that? Felton's mouth tightened. Because it wasn't relevant. I hadn't seen him in years. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. And yet, last night you lied about not seeing or hearing anything unusual. Felton's fingers twitched, then he sighed. All right. I saw him arguing with someone. Not in his room, but downstairs, before he went up for the night. The man in the grey coat. Felton shook his head. No, it was Colby, the salesman. Inspector Graves muttered a curse under his breath. Colby claimed he barely spoke to Royston. Felton let out a dry chuckle. Well, he was lying. They were speaking low, but I caught enough. Royston said something about paying what he owed, and Colby looked furious. It didn't seem like a simple debt. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So Colby had lied, and he had a reason to be angry with Royston. But then, so did Felton himself. And what of Miss Harrington? She had seemed poised, but nervous. She turned back to Felton. Why did you truly come here, Mr. Felton? His jaw clenched, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might refuse to answer, but then, with a sigh, he leaned forward. Royston ruined my brother. Miss Marple remained silent, allowing him to continue. He was a gambler, just like Royston. They played together often. One night, Royston convinced him to bet more than he could afford to lose. A terrible hand, my brother thought. But Royston pushed him, made him believe it was worth the risk. He lost everything, took his own life not long after. I didn't come here to kill Royston, Miss Marple, but I did come to see him, to make him understand what he'd done. Inspector Graves let out a sharp breath. Convenient story. Felton met his gaze. Believe me or don't, I have nothing else to say. Miss Marple studied him a moment longer before rising. She turned to Inspector Graves. I think we should speak with Mr. Colby again. Colby was still in his room, and when they entered, he was sitting on the edge of his bed as if waiting. His ruddy complexion looked a shade paler than before. Graves wasted no time. You lied, Colby. You argued with Royston last night. Colby's eyes darted toward Miss Marple before he let out a huff. Fine. Yes. I spoke to him. He owed me money, a large sum. Said he was going to pay me back soon, but I knew better. I'd seen him pull the same tricks before. And yet, you expect us to believe you left him alive? Colby's lips curled. If I'd killed him, do you think I'd still be sitting here? Inspector Graves scowled, but Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere. She thought of the missing coat. She thought of the playing card. And then she thought of Miss Harrington. The woman who claimed she had no connection to Royston, yet had seemed strangely uneasy. The woman who had been the first to retire, yet whose fingers had twisted in her lap as she spoke. Miss Marple turned to Graves. Inspector, I think it's time we had a word with Miss Harrington. and as they left Colby's room, she felt it at last, that slow unraveling of the tangle. The truth was very near. Inspector Graves wasted no time in summoning Miss Harrington to the parlour. She arrived with her usual composed expression, though Miss Marple did not miss the way her eyes flickered toward the staircase, as if measuring the distance between herself and the front door. She was nervous, though she hid it well. Graves folded his arms, regarding her with the same scrutiny he had shown the others. "Miss Harrington, you told us you barely knew Mr. Royston, but I suspect that's not entirely true. We have reason to believe you had some history with him, perhaps even a motive for wishing him harm." Miss Harrington's fingers curled around the edge of her skirt, but her voice remained steady. "That's absurd. I told you the truth. I exchanged pleasantries with the man, nothing more." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "It is rather odd, though, isn't it, that you should travel here, to this very inn on the same night Mr. Royston met his untimely end. A coincidence, perhaps, but a most unusual one." Miss Harrington stiffened. "I had no idea he would be here." "Then why did you seem so uneasy when his name was first mentioned?" A flicker of something passed over Miss Harrington's face, too quick to be caught by the inspector, but not by Miss Marple. There was guilt there, but not necessarily the guilt of a murderer. No, this was something else. Graves pressed on. "We have another witness who saw Royston in an argument last night, Mr. Felton. He claims it was Colby, but are you certain it was only the one argument? Perhaps there was another later on, when fewer people were watching." For the first time, Miss Harrington's composure cracked. She lowered her gaze, fingers trembling ever so slightly. She exhaled sharply. "I knew Royston, years ago. My brother was involved with him, just like Mr. Felton's, another man who lost everything to one of Royston's games. He didn't take his own life, no, but he was never the same afterward. He wasted away, blaming himself. I came here to confront Royston, to make him answer for what he had done, but I did not kill him." Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "And yet you still lied to us. That doesn't look good, Miss Harrington." "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that simply being here, having a reason to hate him, would make me look guilty. And now—" She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Now it has." Before Graves could respond, the door to the parlour swung open. A constable hurried in, breathless, clutching something in his hands. "Inspector, we found this stuffed behind the hedge near the stables." In his hand was a dark grey coat. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, watching as Graves took it. He turned it over, searching the pockets. The weight of something small and metallic shifted inside, and when he withdrew his hand, he was holding a revolver. A hush fell over the room. Graves exhaled sharply. "Well, that certainly changes things." Miss Harrington's face drained of colour. Graves turned to the constable. "Where exactly was this found?" "Not far from the road, sir. Someone must have thrown it out in a hurry." Graves turned back to Miss Harrington. "I suppose you'll say you've never seen this coat before." She hesitated, swallowing hard. I... Before she could finish, another voice cut in. "That coat isn't hers." It was Mr. Colby, standing in the doorway, looking as though he had just made a desperate gamble himself. Graves narrowed his eyes. "Explain yourself." Colby ran a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. "Because it's mine." Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her sharp eyes studying him. Colby's ruddy complexion had turned pale, and he looked suddenly much older than he had before. Graves straightened. "Are you confessing to the murder of Mr. Royston?" Colby hesitated. "No, I didn't shoot him, but I was there. I went to his room last night." "Start from the beginning." Colby let out a long breath. "I told you Royston owed me money. What I didn't tell you was that last night he promised to settle the debt. Said he had something valuable on him. Told me to come up after midnight. I did. But when I got there, he trailed off, jaw tightening. He was already dead, Miss Marple finished for him. Colby nodded grimly. The door was unlocked. I found him lying there, the gun on the floor. I panicked. I knew how it would look, so I took the gun, stuffed it in my coat and ran. Tossed the coat outside, hoping it wouldn't be found. Graves rubbed his forehead. You expect us to believe you didn't fire that gun? Colby held up his hands. I swear it. He was already gone when I got there. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then turned to Graves. Perhaps there is a way to be certain. Graves followed her gaze to the revolver. Ballistics. If it matches the bullet that killed Royston, we'll know if this was the murder weapon. He turned to the constable. Take this to be examined at once. As the constable hurried away, Graves shook his head. Well, Colby, you're still in a mess of trouble, whether you pulled the trigger or not. Colby sagged into a chair, rubbing his temples. I know. Miss Marple remained silent, thoughts ticking away in her mind. Something about this didn't sit right. Colby's story had elements of truth. She was sure of that. But it wasn't the whole truth. Royston had been a gambler, a man who weighed risks carefully. If he had called Colby up to his room, he had intended to settle his debt in some way, but Royston had also been afraid. That much had been clear from the way he acted in the hours before his death. And then there was the playing card, the ace of spades, deliberately placed on his chest. No, this was not over. As Graves turned to give instructions to his men, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift to the staircase once more. Somewhere in this inn, the real killer was still watching, waiting, calculating their next move. And if there was one thing she knew about people who gambled with lives, it was that they never stopped playing until the game was truly over. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of the inn's parlor, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of horses' hooves on the cobbled road, the world continuing on as if nothing had happened. And yet, within these walls, a great unraveling was about to begin. The crime, so carefully arranged to appear as a simple murder over debts, had threads stretching further back, threads that had yet to be properly followed. She sipped her tea, her sharp mind sifting through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every movement from the night before. Colby's confession had given them a direction, but Miss Marple knew instinctively that they had been led down a false trail. A crime of this nature was never so straightforward, and the deeper she looked, the more she sensed its roots were buried in the past, rather than the present. Inspector Graves re-entered the room, his coat still dusted from the wind outside. Colby's revolver is being examined now, he announced, though his voice held none of the confidence one might expect from a man so close to closing a case. He hesitated, then added, You think we've gone off course, don't you, Miss Marple? She smiled gently. I think, Inspector, that Mr. Royston's past holds far more significance than we have given it credit for. Graves exhaled. His past is a sordid one, if the whispers are to be believed. Gambling, deception, a fair number of ruined men left in his wake. But men like Royston make enemies by the dozen. Finding the one who finally decided to put an end to him is the trouble. Miss Marple placed her cup down with delicate precision. Perhaps, Inspector, we have been looking for an enemy from last night when we should be looking much further back. She had been thinking of the playing card, the ace of spades, a symbol of death in certain circles. Royston had been a man who prided himself on his luck, a gambler who played with lives as carelessly as he did with money. But luck eventually ran out, and Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that someone had been waiting a very long time for Royston's to do just that. She turned her thoughts to Miss Harrington, who had been so reluctant to speak of her past. She had admitted her brother had been ruined by Royston, but had she told them the full story? And then there was Felton, who had known Royston long ago, but had also tried to distance himself from that knowledge. These were not strangers merely caught in unfortunate coincidence. They were tied together by something deeper. "Inspector," Miss Marple said suddenly, "I should like to speak with Miss Harrington once more." They found her in the dimly lit corridor, standing by the window as if lost in thought. At the sound of their approach, she turned, her face unreadable. "You've come to accuse me again, I suppose," she said, though there was a weariness in her voice rather than anger. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Not at all, my dear. I only wish to ask you something. You spoke of your brother, of how Royston ruined him, but you never told us his name." Miss Harrington hesitated. His name was Edward. Edward Harrington." Graves frowned. "That name sounds familiar." Miss Marple nodded. "Because it should. Edward Harrington was involved in a rather infamous gambling scandal some years ago, was he not?" Miss Harrington's lips pressed together, her shoulders rigid. "Yes," she admitted. "Royston set him up, tricked him into a wager he couldn't win. And when Edward tried to expose him, Royston made certain that my brother was the one ruined instead. It was more than losing money. It was his reputation, his entire future." Graves let out a slow breath. "And you've hated Royston ever since?" Miss Harrington's chin lifted slightly. "Wouldn't you?" Miss Marple regarded her carefully. "You came here for revenge, Miss Harrington, but you did not come here to kill him." The younger woman blinked in surprise. "No," she said after a moment. "I only wanted him to answer for what he'd done. I wanted him to know that he had not been forgotten." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but she said nothing further. There was truth in Miss Harrington's words, but that truth did not solve the murder. Graves scratched at his chin. "If it wasn't you, then that still leaves Felton, or—" Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the folds of her dress. "Or someone we have not yet truly considered." The realization came as softly as a whisper, but with the force of something undeniable. They had looked at those with grudges against Royston, but what if they had missed the most obvious connection of all? "Inspector," she said, "we must look into Royston's own past beyond gambling. Not just the people he wronged, but the people he may have once trusted. If my instincts are correct, we are not dealing with the simple vengeance of a ruined man. We are dealing with a betrayal long in the making." Graves gave her a sharp look. "You think the killer wasn't after justice, but something else?" Miss Marple nodded. "I think we have assumed that revenge was the primary motive. But what if Royston's death was not about punishing him for the past, but rather ensuring he would not reveal something about it?" A silence stretched between them. Then Graves muttered a curse under his breath. "We've been looking at this all wrong." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "Perhaps not all wrong, Inspector, but I do believe we've been misled, and I suspect the true culprit is someone who has been waiting a very long time for their moment to strike." The past had not simply shaped this crime, it had dictated it. And now, as Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the inn's quiet hallways, she knew they were closer than ever to uncovering the secret that had taken a lifetime to conceal. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her sharp eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. There was a moment of silence, thick with the weight of unspoken suspicions. Inspector Graves stood with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed in thought. Across from them, Miss Harrington remained poised, though there was an unmistakable tension in her fingers as they rested lightly against the arm of her chair. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. The past was key. This murder had its roots buried deep within it. But she needed more. A crack in the facade. Something small yet telling, a moment of revelation that could not be undone. And she had an idea of how to find it. She turned to Inspector Graves, her voice as mild as ever. "Inspector, I wonder if we might attempt something unorthodox." Graves arched a brow. "I assume you have something in mind." She nodded. I should like to conduct a little demonstration, nothing more than a simple experiment." Graves gave her a wary look, but gestured for her to continue. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the nearby writing desk, where a fresh deck of playing cards had been left. With careful precision, she removed the ace of spades, the very symbol that had been found beside Royston's lifeless body. She held it up, studying its crisp edges before turning her attention back to the room. "Cards are an interesting thing," she mused. "To some, they are a mere pastime. To others, they are a weapon, one that can build fortunes or ruin lives. And sometimes, they hold memories that cannot easily be erased." She set the card on the table and gently tapped its surface. "I should like to ask each of you to take a turn holding this card. Nothing more. Just hold it and tell me what comes to mind." There was a flicker of confusion in Miss Harrington's eyes. "What possible purpose does that serve?" Miss Marple smiled. "Ah, but isn't that the very nature of games, my dear? We never quite know what they may reveal." The first to step forward was Felton. He picked up the card between two fingers, examined it briefly, and shrugged. "Reminds me of the old days," he said. "Royston used to pull tricks with cards, always had an ace up his sleeve, sometimes literally." He tossed it back onto the table and stepped away. Miss Harrington was next. She hesitated before picking up the card, her fingers running over its surface as if it might burn her. "It's just a card," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. She placed it back down carefully, as though it carried a weight beyond its paper form. Finally, the card lay untouched on the table, waiting. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the last person in the room, one who had remained conspicuously silent throughout. Mr. Grayson, the innkeeper. The man had been in the background of the investigation, always present, yet never truly in focus. He had answered questions, provided information when asked, but had never drawn attention to himself. And yet, Miss Marple had noticed something peculiar about him. A stillness, a carefulness in his words, as though he was measuring each one before speaking. "Mr. Grayson," she said gently, "would you mind?" The innkeeper hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Seems a foolish thing," he muttered, but he reached, for the card nonetheless. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, something changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. His expression, so carefully neutral before, flickered, just for a second. A sharp intake of breath, a tension in his shoulders. A fleeting moment of recognition that could not be disguised. Miss Marple caught it. She said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. Grayson's hand lingered on the card for a moment longer than necessary, before he set it down, withdrawing as if it had stung him. He cleared his throat. "Nothing much to say about it," he murmured. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "I think, Mr. Grayson, that you recognize it more than you let on." He looked at her sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "It means that this is not just a card to you. It is a symbol, a memory, a reminder of something long buried, something that has come back to the surface." Grayson's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "You're imagining things, ma'am." But Miss Marple knew she was not. She had seen the way his breath had caught, the way his hands had trembled just slightly, and more than that, she had seen the flicker of something deeper, something akin to pain. "Mr. Grayson," she continued, her voice as soft as ever, "how long have you been here at the inn?" 10 years, he replied. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "And before that?" There was the smallest pause. "Traveled a bit," he said. "Worked in different places." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Gambling establishments, perhaps?" Grayson stiffened. It was the barest reaction, but it was enough. "You knew Royston before, didn't you?" she pressed, her tone still gentle but unwavering. A heavy silence filled the room. Graves straightened, his sharp gaze locked on the innkeeper. Felton and Miss Harrington exchanged uneasy glances. Grayson exhaled, long and slow. "A long time ago," he admitted finally. "But that don't mean anything." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "It means everything, Mr. Grayson. Because I believe this crime was never about mere revenge. It was about something Royston knew, something he might have spoken of. And you, more than anyone, had a reason to make sure he never did." Grayson's face was pale now, his hands gripping the back of a chair as though for support. He said nothing, but Miss Marple could see it, the walls closing in, the realization that his carefully concealed past had finally caught up with him. The ace of spades lay between them, silent but damning, and Miss Marple knew without a doubt that the truth was about to come to light. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on Grayson, watching the way his hands clenched the back of the chair, his knuckles whitening. She had struck a nerve, but before she could press further, the tension in the room was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor. A moment later, the door burst open, revealing Sergeant Wilkes, his face flushed and breath coming in short bursts. "Inspector, the evidence. It's gone." Inspector Graves straightened at once. "Gone? What are you talking about, man?" Wilkes swallowed, his hands twitching at his sides. "The ace of spades, the one found on Royston's body. It was locked away with the rest of the evidence, but it's disappeared." A sharp silence filled the room, thick with unspoken suspicions. Graves was on his feet in an instant, his face dark with fury. "That's impossible. The evidence room is secured." "I checked it myself not an hour ago," Wilkes insisted. "But when I returned just now, the lock was broken. Everything else is in place, but that card, it's missing." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with something close to satisfaction, though her expression remained mild. "How very interesting." Graves turned toward her, his patience wearing thin. "Interesting, Miss Marple? I'd say it's more than that. This is deliberate tampering." "Oh, undoubtedly," she agreed. "Someone is rather desperate to keep us from connecting the final dots. But what's most telling, dear Inspector, is that of all the evidence, only that particular card was taken." Felton, who had been listening intently, exhaled sharply. "So someone here is afraid of what it might reveal?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely. And one must ask, why? What significance does that card hold beyond its presence at the crime scene?" Her eyes flicked back to Grayson, who had gone very still. The others had turned to look at him as well, and for a fleeting moment, something unreadable passed over his face before he quickly masked it. Miss Harrington spoke next, her voice quiet but edged with tension. "Who had access to the evidence room?" "Only the inspector, Sergeant Wilkes, and myself," Graves answered, his jaw tight. "But that lock, whoever did it forced their way in. This wasn't an inside job." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. "Perhaps not, but one wonders if the culprit was truly after the card itself, or rather, what it represents." Graves let out an exasperated sigh. "You're speaking in riddles again, Miss Marple." She smiled, unbothered. "Oh, not riddles, Inspector. Just a matter of perspective. You see, that ace of spades was not merely a clue. It was a message." Felton frowned. "A message?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. You see, Mr. Royston was a man of habits. He was clever in his way, but he enjoyed a bit of dramatic flair, did he not?" She gestured to Felton. "You said it yourself. He often had an ace up his sleeve." Felton's expression darkened as realization struck. "You think he left it deliberately? As a signal?" She smiled. A rather theatrical one, yes. "But it suggests that in his final moments he had reason to fear someone specific, someone he wished to expose. The problem, of course, is that he might not have had the strength to leave the message as clearly as he wished." Grayson let out a low breath, his hands flexing against the chair. "You're saying the card wasn't just chance," Miss Marple finished gently. "But now someone has ensured we can't examine it further." Graves shook his head. "What difference does it make? We know what it was." "Oh, but details matter, Inspector," she replied, her tone light but firm. "For instance, was the card creased as if it had been clenched in a dying hand? Or was it placed neatly, as if left by another? And what of the ink? Was there a smudge, a hidden mark? Royston knew the game well. He might have written something, even if only a single letter." A fresh wave of silence passed through the room as the weight of her words settled. Miss Harrington, usually composed, now looked pale. "But if that's true, then whoever stole the card must be the very person Royston was trying to name." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely." A chill seemed to pass through the room. The loss of the card was no accident. It was a deliberate act of concealment. But the thief had made a grave mistake. By removing the evidence, they had drawn even more attention to it, and Miss Marple knew with absolute certainty that the real game was about to begin. The air inside the drawing room was thick with unspoken tension, every person caught in a web of suspicion. The missing ace of spades had not only deepened the mystery, but had also sent a clear message. The true culprit was still watching, still maneuvering unseen. Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, her sharp eyes scanning each face in turn. The atmosphere was heavy, expectant, until a sudden, sharp noise cut through the silence. A crash, the unmistakable shatter of glass. Inspector Graves was the first to move, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his hip. Felton swore under his breath, while Miss Harrington clutched the arm of her chair, her face draining of color. Miss Marple, however, did not startle. Instead, she merely sighed and rose to her feet. "I do believe," she murmured, "that something rather unfortunate has just occurred." The group hurried from the drawing room, following the sound down the hallway. At the far end, one of the tall windows overlooking the garden had been smashed inward, shards of glass glinting in the moonlight. A single curtain fluttered wildly in the night air. Graves moved quickly, peering outside into the darkness. The hedges rustled, disturbed by something or someone, moving beyond them. "There!" Wilkes shouted, already in pursuit. He bolted through the broken window, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel path outside. Graves was close behind him, disappearing into the shadows. Felton hovered near the shattered glass, his expression torn between apprehension and urgency. "Should we—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "This was a distraction." Felton turned to her, puzzled. "A distraction? From what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the hallway, her footsteps unhurried but purposeful. The others hesitated only a moment before following her. She led them past the drawing room, past the library, until she reached the study, the very room where the evidence had been stored. The door was ajar. Miss Harrington gasped. "But Inspector Graves locked this after the card went missing." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed he did, which means someone else possesses a key, or was simply waiting for an opportunity to slip inside." With delicate precision, she pushed the door open, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. Papers were scattered across the desk, a chair overturned. The heavy safe in the corner hung open, its contents disturbed. But the most jarring sight was what lay in the center of the rug. A body. Felton recoiled, cursing under his breath. Miss Harrington let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Miss Marple merely stepped forward, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. The man on the floor was Mr. Grayson. His eyes were wide, frozen in an expression of shock, his mouth slightly open as if he had tried to call for help. His right hand clutched his chest, while his left was splayed on the floor, fingers curled inward. A small, gleaming object rested near his outstretched fingertips, a second ace of spades. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. How very unfortunate. Felton forced himself to step closer, his voice tight. Is he? Quite dead, Miss Marple confirmed. She knelt beside the body, her keen eyes taking in every detail. A rather abrupt end for someone so recently under suspicion. Miss Harrington swallowed hard. You think someone killed him to keep him silent? Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. Or perhaps he knew too much and was foolish enough to act upon it. She lifted her gaze toward the open safe, her expression thoughtful. Either way, this tells us something rather crucial. Felton crouched beside her, staring at the second ace. Another card. Is the killer leaving a message again? Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Oh no, my dear boy. This time I rather think the message was meant for Mr. Grayson himself. Felton's brow furrowed. I don't follow. Miss Marple gestured toward the card. You see, the first ace of spades, now missing, was likely left by Mr. Royston. A final clue meant to expose his killer, but this second one? I suspect it was left for Mr. Grayson as a warning. A gambler would understand its meaning instantly. Felton's expression darkened as realization set in. A losing hand. Quite. Miss Marple rose smoothly to her feet. Someone wanted Mr. Grayson to know that his time had run out. Miss Harrington shivered. But then why kill him? If he was being warned, doesn't that mean the killer wanted him alive? At least for a while longer. Miss Marple tapped a thoughtful finger against her chin. An excellent question. One must wonder, did Mr. Grayson push too far? Did he perhaps uncover the killer's identity on his own? Felton stood, shaking his head. But if he did, why not tell us? Why not go to the authorities? Miss Marple sighed. Because, my dear, men like Mr. Grayson do not go to the authorities. They play their own games, believing they can outmaneuver their opponents. She glanced back down at the lifeless form. Unfortunately, this time, he was outmatched. A noise from the hallway made them all turn. Graves and Wilkes reappeared, breathless from their chase. Lost them, Graves muttered, scowling. Whoever it was, they knew the grounds too well. He stopped abruptly as his gaze landed on the body. His expression darkened. Damn it all! Wilkes exhaled sharply. Another one. Graves ran a hand over his face, his frustration palpable. This is getting out of hand. First the card. Now this? He looked to Miss Marple. Tell me you've got something useful, or we're chasing ghosts. Miss Marple studied him for a moment before speaking. I believe, Inspector, that we are no longer merely solving a crime. She gestured toward Grayson's body. We are now trying to prevent the next one. Graves stiffened. You think they'll strike again? Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. Oh, Inspector, I'm quite certain of it. Miss Marple stood very still, her gaze sweeping over the room. The chaos of the evening, the shattered window, the chase through the gardens, the body of Mr. Grayson, had all been designed to confuse, to distract. But the true nature of the game was becoming clear. The second ace of spades was not a message for them, but a signal within a game only the murderer fully understood. And yet, Miss Marple suspected they had seen the answer already, hidden in plain sight. Inspector Graves was barking orders, telling Wilkes to secure the study and Felton to double-check the whereabouts of everyone in the house. But Miss Marple was thinking, sorting through each detail, each clue. It was then that she noticed something. Something so ordinary it had gone overlooked. A single sheet of paper, fluttering slightly at the edge of the desk, nearly lost in the disorder. It was a telegram, and though the words had been scribbled hastily, their meaning struck her like a hammer. Received your message. No need to worry. Meeting postponed. See. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had seen this telegram before, briefly, among Mr. Royston's papers. But the first time, it had seemed meaningless, just another piece of correspondence in a gambler's life. Now, in light of everything that had happened, it carried a new weight. "Inspector," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness, "would you be so kind as to recall for me the precise time Mr. Grayson arrived at the estate on the night of Mr. Royston's murder?" Graves frowned, caught off guard by the question. "Grayson? He arrived shortly after the body was found, didn't he? Along with the others?" "No," Miss Harrington said suddenly, blinking as she recalled. "He was here before. I remember now. He was in the parlor when I came in from the terrace. I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple nodded. "Which means he was here when Mr. Royston was still alive." She gestured to the telegram. "And yet Mr. Royston had already sent this message, implying he expected someone else to arrive." Felton exhaled sharply. "Which means he was expecting a visitor that night." His eyes darted toward the body of Grayson. "And if Grayson knew who that was, he became a liability," Miss Marple finished. "The ace of spades was not only a threat but a warning. Mr. Grayson believed he had an advantage, that he could bargain or manipulate the situation to his benefit. But he miscalculated." She looked at Graves. "There is one person among us who knew the precise moment when the first murder occurred. One person who had reason to want Royston dead, but more importantly, to ensure that his final message never reached the wrong hands." Graves narrowed his eyes. "You're saying we've been looking at this all wrong?" Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. "Not wrong, Inspector, just not quite right." A hush fell over the room as the pieces clicked into place. The pattern had been there all along, hidden beneath the false starts and misdirection. And now, with the truth within reach, the murderer would be forced to make their final move. Miss Marple let the silence settle, her gaze moving from face to face, observing the flickers of tension that passed through the room. She had seen it before, how guilt and fear manifested in the smallest of gestures, a tightening of the jaw, the twitch of a hand. Somewhere among them stood the person who had woven this intricate web of deception, and now the threads were beginning to unravel. Felton cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably. If Royston was expecting someone else that night, then who? And why kill Grayson? If he knew something, wouldn't it have been easier to silence him without drawing attention? Miss Marple gave him an encouraging nod. "A sensible observation, my dear boy. But you see, this crime, both crimes, were not solely about convenience. There was a message in both murders. The ace of spades was not just a symbol of gambling or chance. It was a signature, a calling card." Graves's brows furrowed. "A signature? You mean to say this was personal?" "Very much so," Miss Marple said. "And to understand the motive, we must look beyond the surface, to something buried deep in the past." She tapped the telegram on the desk. "This is where it began. Not on the night of the murder, but before. This message was never meant to be read. It was meant to be erased." Miss Harrington frowned. "But who would need to erase a simple telegram?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Someone who knew that what Royston had arranged that night would reveal an old betrayal, and that, I believe, is why Mr. Royston had to die." She turned to Graves. "Inspector, I wonder if we might take another look at Royston's financial records. I suspect we shall find a rather interesting connection to an old debt, one not recorded in his usual gambling dealings." Graves, though skeptical, gestured for Wilkes to retrieve the documents. As they were brought out, Miss Marple sifted through them with delicate fingers, pausing at a particular sheet. A loan. Not an unusual thing for Royston, but what was unusual was the date. "Ah," she murmured, tracing the ink. "Here we are. A rather large sum, taken out 20 years ago, just after a rather scandalous affair that, if I recall correctly, ended quite tragically." Felton leaned in. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" She folded her hands. "You see, 20 years ago, before Mr. Royston became the man we knew, a gambler, a manipulator, a man who made his fortune on the misfortunes of others, He was involved in a matter of much greater consequence. He held a secret, one that someone was willing to kill to protect. Miss Harrington gasped. You mean this isn't just about gambling debts? Miss Marple shook her head. No, my dear. This is about betrayal, a debt that was not merely financial, but personal. I believe Mr. Royston knew something that should have remained buried, a past crime, perhaps, or a broken trust. And the moment he tried to leverage that knowledge, he became a target. The realization sent a ripple through the room. Felton glanced uneasily toward Graves, who was now studying the documents with newfound scrutiny. But what about Grayson? Graves asked. Why kill him too? Miss Marple sighed. Because Grayson was clever enough to see the connection, he thought he could use it to his advantage, but he underestimated the lengths to which our murderer would go to keep the past buried. Graves set his jaw. And who exactly is our murderer, Miss Marple? She turned slowly, her sharp eyes locking onto a single figure who had remained too silent, too composed amid the storm of revelations. Isn't it obvious, Inspector? The only person who had the most to lose if the past ever came to light. The room went deathly still. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. And now the real confrontation would begin. Miss Marple straightened slightly, her hands folding neatly before her. The hush in the room had thickened, pressing upon the walls as if even the house itself was holding its breath. All eyes followed her gaze as it settled upon one person, Charles Felton. For a fleeting moment, he did not react, maintaining the same attentive poise he had held throughout the investigation. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the smallest of human frailties, noticed the way his fingers curled inward just slightly, the briefest flicker of tension in his jaw. It was enough. "You were very clever, Mr. Felton," she said gently, her voice free of accusation. "More clever than you ought to have been. If you had let sleeping dogs lie, Mr. Royston's past might never have come to light. But you saw an opportunity, didn't you? You must have thought yourself quite fortunate when you discovered what he had been hiding all these years." Felton let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I've been assisting the investigation from the start." "Indeed," she agreed. "And it was most helpful of you, but there were little things, you see. The way you always arrived precisely when a breakthrough was made, as though you already knew which threads to pull. The way you so effortlessly deduced why Mr. Grayson had been killed. Because he knew something, but never asked the obvious question, how did the murderer know that Grayson had figured it out? Unless, of course, they were watching him very closely." Felton's brow furrowed slightly, but Miss Marple saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing his options, deciding how to proceed. "And then there is the matter of the telegram," she continued. "That was the moment I was quite sure. You see, Mr. Royston must have suspected he was in danger. He arranged for that meeting, not to settle a debt, but because he had something, evidence perhaps, or knowledge, too important to keep to himself any longer. And someone intercepted that information. Someone who had access to his personal affairs." Felton smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Miss Marple, you can't possibly be suggesting—" "Oh, but I can," she interrupted softly. "Because you made a mistake. A very small one, but crucial nonetheless. When I mentioned the telegram earlier, you did not ask who it had been sent to. You assumed because you already knew." The silence that followed was absolute. Graves took a slow step forward, his hand drifting toward the cuffs at his belt. "Mr. Felton," he said evenly, "I think you'd best explain yourself." Felton's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might try to feign ignorance, to weave one last thread into the tapestry of his deception. But then his shoulders slackened just a fraction. A quiet sigh left his lips. "You're very good, Miss Marple," he murmured. The admission hung in the air like a drop of ink spreading through water, but there was no time to savor it. The shift in Felton's expression was subtle but unmistakable. a man cornered, calculating his next move. Before anyone could react, he lunged, not toward the door as Graves might have expected, but toward Miss Harrington. His hand darted toward the letter opener that lay atop the desk, his grip closing around the handle with alarming speed. Miss Harrington gasped, stumbling backward, but Miss Marple did not so much as flinch. "Oh, Mr. Felton," she sighed almost sadly. Violence is always the last refuge of a man who is lost. Felton hesitated, his arm halfway raised, his breath coming short. Graves had already drawn his revolver. "Put it down," Graves ordered. For a moment, Felton's knuckles whitened against the handle. Then, with a sharp breath, he released his grip, letting the letter opener clatter onto the desk. The fight was over. Wilkes moved in swiftly, securing Felton's wrists with a cold snap of handcuffs. The weight of the moment settled over the room as he was led toward the door, his once calm demeanor now replaced with something else. Exhaustion, perhaps, or resignation. Miss Harrington let out a shaky breath. He could have." "He wouldn't have," Miss Marple said gently. It was the act of a man who had already lost everything. Felton turned slightly, his gaze meeting Miss Marple's. There was something unreadable in his eyes. And then, with a quiet sigh, he allowed himself to be led away. Miss Marple let out a slow breath, turning to the others with a small, knowing smile. "Well," she said, "I do believe that is that." And just like that, the house exhaled. Miss Marple watched as Charles Felton was led away, his once carefully crafted composure now crumbling under the weight of his downfall. The room, which had been thick with tension, began to exhale, a slow release of collective breath, as if everyone had been holding on just a bit too tightly. Inspector Graves muttered something about getting a full confession. Wilkes straightened his cuffs with a weary shake of the head, and Miss Harrington, visibly shaken, reached for her sherry glass with unsteady fingers. It seemed, at last, that the matter was settled. And yet, Miss Marple remained in her seat, fingers laced delicately in her lap, her expression placid, but her mind as sharp as ever. Something still lingered at the edge of her thoughts, like a thread left hanging in an otherwise perfectly knitted pattern. A small, seemingly insignificant detail that refused to be dismissed. It was then that she noticed the way Lord Percival Royston had not moved. Unlike the others, who were either relieved or shaken, he stood utterly still, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance, his mouth set in an odd line. Miss Marple had observed many people in moments of great revelation. Some gasped, some protested, some even wept. But this was different. A quiet stirring of instinct pricked at her mind. "Lord Royston," she said softly, "it must be quite a relief to have the matter settled." His gaze snapped to her, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief that only someone with Miss Marple's particular eye would have caught it, there was something else there. Panic? No, not quite. A recalculation, a sudden shift in thought, as though he had expected to be out of danger and now found himself once more under scrutiny. "Yes," he said after a pause. "Quite." But his voice did not match his words. It was then that Miss Marple knew. Felton had been guilty, yes, but not of everything. "Oh dear," she murmured, a slight frown creasing her brow. She turned to Graves, who was busy giving instructions to Wilkes. "Inspector, I do believe we have overlooked something rather important." Graves glanced at her, already halfway toward the door. "Miss Marple, I think we can safely say the matter is closed." Miss Marple smiled, the sort of indulgent smile one might give a child who had overlooked an obvious lesson. "Ah, but that is precisely where we have been misled. You see, Mr. Felton was indeed quite guilty, but the true architect of this entire dreadful affair was someone else entirely." The room, which had begun to settle into relief, tensed again. A current of unease rippled through the air. Miss Harrington, who had just taken a rather large sip of sherry, coughed violently. What on earth do you mean, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Lord Royston, whose jaw had gone taut. "I rather think that Mr. Felton was always intended to be the scapegoat," she said lightly. "He had motive, means, and opportunity, but the problem, you see, is that there are certain details that do not quite align. The missing evidence, for example. If Mr. Felton was truly acting alone, why was he so desperate to retrieve something that would only implicate him further? It seems rather foolish, doesn't it?" Graves frowned. "Perhaps he panicked." Miss Marple shook her head. No, Felton was a calculating man. He wouldn't have panicked, not unless something else forced his hand. Something or someone. Silence. And then, with the same calm that had guided her through the entire case, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Lord Royston," she said pleasantly, "do tell me, when exactly did you decide to let Mr. Felton take the fall for you?" A long pause. Lord Royston's face remained unreadable, but something in the room had shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening of the air. The others were staring at him now, waiting. Miss Harrington gasped. Graves took an instinctive step forward. Royston exhaled, slow and measured. Then, quite suddenly, he smiled. "Well," he said, almost admiringly, "aren't you quite something, Miss Marple?" It was not a denial. Graves stiffened. "Lord Royston," he said sharply, "are you admitting—" "Oh, let us not be melodramatic," Royston interrupted smoothly, waving a hand. "I rather think we all knew that Felton wasn't bright enough to orchestrate the entire thing on his own." He turned to Miss Marple, his smile thin but not unkind. "Tell me, Miss Marple, what gave me away?" Miss Marple sighed. "A very simple thing, really," she said. "You see, when I mentioned the missing evidence earlier, you did not react as one might expect. You see, most innocent men, when told that something has been stolen which could potentially implicate them, would express shock, confusion, or at the very least, curiosity. You, however, did not. You already knew." Royston chuckled softly, shaking his head. And here I thought I had played the perfect game. "You almost did," Miss Marple agreed. "But the problem with such elaborate schemes is that they are never quite as foolproof as one imagines." She turned to Graves, her expression once more placid. "I do believe, Inspector, that you might want to ensure both gentlemen are taken into custody." Graves did not need to be told twice. Within moments, Royston's hands were secured, and the room seemed to release another breath. This time, a true exhale of finality. As Royston was led toward the door, he cast one last look at Miss Marple. "You would have made an excellent player at my table," he said, almost regretfully. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, I rather think I prefer a good game of bridge," she said lightly. And with that, Lord Royston was gone. Miss Harrington collapsed into a chair, fanning herself. "Well," she breathed, "I think I need another sherry." Graves turned to Miss Marple, shaking his head in reluctant admiration. "I don't know how you do it," he muttered. Miss Marple simply smiled, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "Oh, Inspector," she said sweetly, "one only needs to pay attention." As the dust settled in the grand drawing-room of Ashworth Manor, the weight of the evening's revelations pressed upon all who remained. Miss Marple, ever composed, sipped her tea in quiet contemplation, while Inspector Graves issued orders to his men. Charles Felton and Lord Royston had both been taken into custody, their elaborate scheme dismantled piece by piece. And yet, a strange, lingering sense of unease filled the air. It was the kind of silence that did not quite signify triumph. Rather, it hinted at something unresolved, something just beyond the edges of certainty. Miss Harrington, still clutching her sherry, gave a nervous chuckle. "Well, that was rather dramatic, wasn't it?" she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. "At least it's all over." Inspector Graves, pacing near the fireplace, stopped mid-step. "Is it?" he muttered, almost to himself. His brow was furrowed, his gaze distant, as if his mind was sifting through the evening's events once more. "I can't shake the feeling that something still isn't right." Miss Marple set her teacup down with a delicate clink. "How very perceptive of you, Inspector," she said warmly, folding her hands in her lap. "Because I dare say this affair is not entirely over." Wilkes, the ever-dutiful constable, straightened in alarm. "But, ma'am, Lord Royston confessed. The evidence—" Miss Marple lifted a gentle hand to halt his protest. "Oh yes, dear Mr. Wilkes, Lord Royston confessed, after he was caught, and only when it became clear that there was no other option. But you see, there is a difference between orchestrating a crime and truly being its master." Miss Harrington gasped. "You don't mean to say there's someone else involved?" Miss Marple sighed. "I very much suspect so." Her gaze swept the room, finally settling on the empty space where Lord Royston had stood only moments before. "Because, my dear friends, let us consider something rather crucial. If Lord Royston was as cunning as he believed himself to be, why was he so careless in his final moments? Why did he allow himself to be caught without an attempt to flee? And more importantly, why did he seem almost resigned?" Inspector Graves' expression darkened. "Are you suggesting he wanted to be caught?" Miss Marple nodded. "I believe he was shielding someone." She turned her gaze toward Miss Harrington, who visibly flinched under the scrutiny. "Me?" Miss Harrington stammered, pressing a hand to her chest. "But that's absurd. I had no part in any of this." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh no, my dear, I don't suspect you. But I do think you may know something without realizing it." Miss Harrington frowned. "Well, I suppose Lord Royston and I have been acquainted for years. He always did have a rather, how should I put it, calculating way about him, but I never suspected—" "That is precisely it," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "He was always too calculating, and yet he misstepped. He faltered in a way that seems unlike him. The only logical explanation is that he was covering for someone who is far more dangerous than himself." A chilling silence fell over the room. Inspector Graves' jaw tightened. "Then who? Who could possibly be more dangerous than Lord Royston?" Miss Marple turned toward the window, her gaze far away. "That, my dear Inspector, is the question, isn't it?" Her voice was calm, but there was a knowing glint in her eyes. "And I do believe the answer is already slipping away into the night." It was then that Wilkes burst through the doorway, breathless and wide-eyed. "Sir, we've just received word. The transport taking Lord Royston to the station. It never arrived." A cold dread gripped the room. Inspector Graves' expression hardened. "What do you mean, never arrived?" Wilkes swallowed hard. "The carriage was found abandoned on the side of the road. No sign of Lord Royston. He's gone." Miss Harrington let out a horrified gasp. "Gone?" Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Oh dear," she murmured. "How very unfortunate." Graves, already grabbing his coat, barked orders. "Set up roadblocks. Search the entire estate. He can't have gotten far." Wilkes hesitated. "Sir, there was something else. The driver, he was found unconscious, and there was a note pinned to his jacket." Graves snatched the note from Wilkes's shaking hands and unfolded it. His eyes narrowed as he read the short, neatly penned message. "You were so close." "But the game isn't over yet." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "I rather feared as much." Miss Harrington clutched at the armrest of her chair. "But what does it mean? Surely they'll catch him." Graves's expression was grim. "Maybe. But if he had help, if this was planned, then he may already be beyond our reach." Miss Marple nodded, rising to her feet with quiet resolve. "Indeed. And that, my dear Inspector, is what makes this case far from over." As the night stretched on, the weight of unfinished business loomed heavily. Lord Royston had escaped, but had he done so alone? Or was there still another hand in play guiding the game from the shadows? Justice had not yet been served, and for Miss Marple, that meant the mystery was far from solved. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees that lined the long driveway of Ashworth Manor. Inspector Graves stood by the window, his fingers drumming against the pane, watching as the last of his officers combed the estate grounds. The search for Lord Royston was proving futile. Hours had passed since his escape, and though roadblocks had been set and every possible route out of the area was under surveillance, the man had vanished as if he had never existed. Miss Marple, standing just behind the inspector, adjusted her gloves with a thoughtful air. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she mused. "How a man so accustomed to control would allow himself to be captured, only to disappear the moment he was no longer in our grasp." Graves let out a weary sigh. "You still believe he was playing a part?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a knowing smile. "Oh, without a doubt, but not entirely of his own volition." Miss Harrington, still visibly shaken, looked between them. But if he was working with someone, who could it be? Who would have the means to orchestrate such a precise escape? Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the dimly lit room, her eyes settling on the mantelpiece, where a faint layer of dust remained undisturbed, except for one peculiar absence. She stepped forward, gently tracing the empty space. "How curious," she murmured. Graves turned. "What is it?" Miss Marple's fingers lingered over the outline of what had once been there. "A small clock used to sit here, did it not?" she asked. Miss Harrington blinked. "Why, yes, a silver one. It belonged to Lord Royston. And now," Miss Marple continued, her voice even, "it's missing." Graves frowned. "You think it's important?" "Oh, Inspector." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the glint of discovery. "I think it's everything." A slow realization dawned over Graves' face. "Are you saying Royston didn't plan this alone, but the one who freed him was already here inside the house?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Exactly." Miss Harrington let out a sharp breath. "But everyone here was questioned. Surely we would have noticed." Miss Marple turned to face them fully, her expression unreadable. "Only if we were looking for the wrong thing." Silence stretched between them as the weight of her words settled. Then, from beyond the manor walls, the distant sound of a carriage rolling away into the night echoed faintly. Graves' eyes darkened. "He's gone." Miss Marple clasped her hands. "For now." Graves turned to her. "You think he'll resurface?" A pause. Then, with quiet certainty, Miss Marple replied, "I know he will." Miss Harrington shivered, though the room was warm. "So then, is it truly over?" Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile, but her expression held something deeper, something knowing. "My dear, a mystery is never truly over." She turned, reaching for her coat. "One question always leads to another, does it not? And as long as questions remain, the truth will always find a way to reveal itself." She glanced once more at the empty space on the mantel, then, without another word, stepped into the night. And somewhere, far beyond the manor's reach, a silver clock ticked on, counting down to whatever would come next.